April 14th, 1865. 10:15 p.m. Abraham Lincoln is laughing. He's at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., watching a comedy with his wife, Mary. The play is called Our American Cousin. It's not particularly good, but Lincoln seems to be enjoying himself. The Civil War ended 5 days ago. Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9th. After 4 years of bloodshed, after 655,000 dead, the war is finally over. For the first time in 4 years, Lincoln looks genuinely relaxed. He's slouched in his rocking chair, holding his wife's hand. He's smiling. In the presidential box, just 6 feet behind Lincoln's head, there should be a guard. There isn't. John Frederick Parker, the policeman assigned to protect the President of the United States, left his post 15 minutes ago. He wanted a drink, so he went to the tavern next door. The most powerful man in America is completely unguarded. Meanwhile, climbing the stairs to the dress circle of Ford's Theater, a 26-year-old man with black curly hair and a distinctive mustache moves quietly through the shadows. He's wearing an expensive black suit. In his right pocket, he carries a single-shot Derringer pistol. In his left, a 7-inch Rio Grande knife. His name is John Wilkes Booth. He's one of the most famous actors in America. He's performed at this theater dozens of times. Everyone here knows his face. Nobody questions why he's here. Booth reaches the door to the presidential box. No guard. He opens the outer door, carefully, steps into the narrow hallway, closes it behind him. Then he takes a wooden stick from his pocket and wedges it against the door, creating a makeshift barricade. Now nobody can get in. It's just him and one more door. The door to the box where Abraham Lincoln sits, completely unaware of what's about to happen. Booth places his hand on the door handle. He knows the play by heart. He's waiting for one specific line, the funniest line, the moment when the entire audience will be roaring with laughter. That's when he'll fire. The gunshot will be covered by the noise. Inside the box, Lincoln leans toward his wife and whispers something. She smiles. Their 2 guests, Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée Clara Harris, are focused on the stage. On stage, actor Harry Hawk delivers the line Booth has been waiting for. "Don't know the manners of good society, eh? Well, I guess I know enough to turn you inside out, old gal, you sock-dologizing old man trap." The audience explodes with laughter. Booth opens the door, steps inside, raises the Derringer pistol, aims at the back of Lincoln's head from 6 feet away, and fires. 1 shot. That's all the gun holds. The bullet enters Lincoln's skull behind his left ear. It tears through his brain, cutting through both hemispheres, and lodges behind his right eye socket. Lincoln's head drops forward. His arms go limp. His eyes stay open but see nothing. Mary Todd Lincoln screams. Major Rathbone turns and sees Booth. He lunges forward, trying to grab him. Booth drops the empty pistol, draws his knife, and slashes Rathbone's left arm from shoulder to elbow. Blood sprays across the presidential box. Rathbone staggers backward. Then Booth does something theatrical, something he's been planning. He vaults over the railing and jumps onto the stage, 11 feet down. It's a dramatic exit, the kind an actor would make, except his right spur catches on the Treasury Guard flag draped over the box. He lands awkwardly on his left leg. The fibula snaps. Booth hears it crack, but adrenaline keeps him moving. He straightens up, faces the shocked audience of nearly 1,000 people, and shouts Virginia's state motto, Sic semper tyrannis, thus always to tyrants. Some witnesses later claim he also shouted, "The South is avenged." Most don't hear it over the chaos. Then he runs. Limping badly, dragging his broken leg, he crosses the stage and disappears through the back door. The audience is in pandemonium. Some people think it's part of the play. Others are screaming. Actress Laura Keene, on stage during the shooting, finally understands what happened and shouts, "The president has been shot." That's when the real panic begins. Upstairs, Mary Todd Lincoln is cradling her husband's head, screaming his name over and over. Blood is pooling in the rocking chair. Major Rathbone, despite his own severe wound, staggers to the hallway and tears away Booth's wooden barricade. People rush in. Dr. Charles Leal, a 23-year-old Army surgeon who happened to be in the audience, fights his way into the box. He examines Lincoln quickly, checks for breathing, checks the wound. The diagnosis is immediate and terrible. The bullet destroyed too much of Lincoln's brain. There's nothing anyone can do. He's going to die, but not here. They can't let the president die in a theater. It's undignified. 6 soldiers carry Lincoln down the stairs, out the front door, and across the street to a boarding house owned by William Peterson. They lay him diagonally across a bed. He's 6'4", too tall to fit normally. Doctors work through the night. They remove blood clots from the wound to ease pressure on the brain. They monitor his breathing. They wait. Mary Todd Lincoln sits beside the bed, crying. She can't accept what's happening. She keeps saying his name. Lincoln never responds. He never regains consciousness. At 7:22 a.m. on April 15, 1865, Abraham Lincoln dies. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, who's been in the room all night, says 5 words that history remembers. Now he belongs to the ages. This is the story of how we got to that moment and what happened next. For the next 35 minutes, you'll discover how John Wilkes Booth went from famous actor to presidential assassin, how he recruited a team of conspirators, how the plot evolved from kidnapping to murder, how security failed at every single level, and how the United States government launched the largest manhunt in American history to track down everyone involved. This isn't just about one bullet. This is about obsession, revenge, conspiracy, and the price paid in blood. Before we continue, if you're enjoying this story so far, help the channel grow with a like. And if you want more stories like this, stories about the moments that changed history, subscribe and turn on notifications. I post videos like this every week. Thanks. Now, let's go back. Back to the beginning. To understand how an actor became an assassin, we need to go back to late 1864. John Wilkes Booth wasn't some desperate nobody plotting violence from the shadows. He was American royalty. Theater royalty, at least. His father, Junius Brutus Booth, was one of the most famous Shakespearean actors of the 19th century. His older brother Edwin was even more famous, widely considered the greatest American actor alive, and John himself was a star, performing to sold-out crowds across the country. By 1864, at age 26, Booth was earning over $20,000 a year. That's more than $500,000 in today's money. Women adored him. Men envied him. He had everything. But John Wilkes Booth was different from his family in one crucial way. He was a fanatic. Born in Maryland in 1838, Booth grew up in a border state where slavery was legal, but loyalty to the Union was expected. His family was mostly pro-Union. His brother Edwin despised the Confederacy. But John went the opposite direction. He believed slavery was morally right. He believed the South's cause was just. And he believed Abraham Lincoln was a tyrant destroying the Constitution. When the Civil War started in 1861, Booth's friends expected him to enlist in the Confederate Army. He was young, healthy, passionate about the cause. It seemed obvious. He never enlisted. He claimed he'd promised his mother he wouldn't fight. But the truth was simpler. Booth loved fame too much to risk dying anonymously in some muddy trench in Virginia. He wanted glory, but only if he could be the star. So, instead of fighting, he became a spy, not a major one. Mostly he smuggled quinine and other medicine across Union lines into the South. He carried messages occasionally, small acts of rebellion that let him feel like a Confederate hero without real danger. He also kept performing, and he kept making money. But by late 1864, everything was falling apart for the Confederacy. In September, Sherman captured Atlanta. Grant was slowly strangling Lee's army at Petersburg. The South was dying. Everyone knew it. On November 8, 1864, Abraham Lincoln won re-election. Booth watched the victory celebrations in Washington with absolute rage. Lincoln had just guaranteed 4 more years of war against the South. 4 more years of what Booth saw as tyranny. That's when Booth's plan began to form. If he couldn't save the Confederacy on the battlefield, he'd save it with one bold action. He would kidnap Abraham Lincoln. The plan wasn't entirely insane. If he could kidnap the president and take him to Richmond, the Confederate capital, they could exchange him for thousands of Confederate prisoners of war. With fresh troops, maybe the South could keep fighting. Maybe they could win. Booth started recruiting a team. His first recruit was Samuel Arnold, a childhood friend from Baltimore. Arnold had fought for the Confederacy early in the war, but was discharged after getting sick. He was broke and desperate. Booth offered him money and purpose. Arnold agreed. Next was Michael O'Laughlin, another Baltimore friend. He'd also served in the Confederate Army. He was loyal to Booth, but not particularly intelligent. He agreed because Arnold did. Then came John Surratt, the 20-year-old son of Mary Surratt. Mary owned a boarding house in Washington where Booth sometimes stayed. John was a Confederate courier, meaning he knew all the smuggling routes between Washington and Richmond. His mother was sympathetic to the South and provided her boarding house as a meeting place for Confederate sympathizers. George Atzerodt was recruited next. He was a 30-year-old German immigrant who worked as a carriage painter and boat repairman in Maryland. He knew the Potomac River intimately. His job in the conspiracy would be getting Booth across the river into Virginia after the kidnapping. Atzerodt was weak-willed and alcoholic, but he knew boats. David Harold came next. He was 22, a pharmacy clerk who'd grown up in Maryland and knew the countryside like the back of his hand. He would guide the escape route. Harold was boyish and not very bright, but enthusiastic. And finally, there was Lewis Powell. Powell was different. Powell was a former Confederate soldier who'd fought at Gettysburg. He was 6'2", incredibly strong, and had killed men in battle. After being wounded and captured, he escaped from a Union hospital and made his way to Maryland, where he met Booth. Booth saw something in Powell, a willingness to do violence without hesitation. Powell had dead eyes, the kind you get after too much war. When Booth explained the kidnapping plot, Powell didn't ask questions, he just agreed. By January 1865, Booth had his team. They met regularly at Mary Surratt's boarding house at 541 H Street in Washington. Mary knew exactly what they were planning. She stored weapons for them, she provided alibis. She was complicit from day one. The original plan was to ambush Lincoln's carriage while he traveled to Campbell Hospital on the outskirts of Washington. Lincoln visited wounded soldiers there regularly, often with minimal security. Booth's team would overpower the guards, tie up Lincoln, and ride south to the Potomac. Atzerodt would row them across. From there, Confederate sympathizers would smuggle them to Richmond. They waited for the opportunity. It never came. Lincoln's schedule kept changing. Sometimes he'd cancel the hospital visits. Sometimes he'd travel with too many soldiers. Sometimes the weather was wrong. Weeks passed. Booth's team grew restless. Arnold and O'Laughlin started talking about quitting. They'd signed up for kidnapping, not a suicide mission. Then came March 4th, 1865. Lincoln's second inauguration. Booth attended. He stood in the crowd as Lincoln gave his inaugural address. Those famous words, "with malice toward none, with charity for all." Booth seethed. To him, Lincoln was offering weakness disguised as mercy. The South needed to be punished for rebellion, not forgiven. As he stood there listening, Booth was close enough to kill Lincoln right then. But he didn't. He wanted the kidnapping, the dramatic exchange, the glory. 3 days later, he tried again. On March 7th, Lincoln was scheduled to attend a play at Campbell Hospital. Booth's entire team assembled along the route. This was it. The perfect opportunity. Except Lincoln didn't come. At the last minute, he'd changed plans and attended a ceremony at the National Hotel instead. Booth was furious. His team was demoralized. Arnold and O'Laughlin officially quit. They wanted nothing more to do with it. Then everything changed. On April 2nd, Petersburg fell. On April 3rd, Richmond fell. On April 9th, Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse. The war was over. The Confederacy was finished. Booth's kidnapping plan was now completely pointless. There was no Confederate government left to negotiate with, no Richmond to take Lincoln to. But Booth didn't accept it. On April 11th, 2 days after Appomattox, Lincoln gave a speech from the White House. Balcony to a celebrating crowd. Booth was there in the audience with his companion, Lewis Powell. Lincoln spoke about Reconstruction, about reuniting the country, and then he said something that made Booth's blood boil. He said he supported giving voting rights to some black men, specifically to educated blacks and to black men who'd served in the Union Army. To Booth, this was the ultimate outrage. Not only had Lincoln destroyed the South, now he wanted to give former slaves political power. Booth turned to Powell and whispered, "That means Negro citizenship. That is the last speech he will ever make." The decision was made in that moment. No more kidnapping. Lincoln had to die. But Booth went even further. Why kill just Lincoln? Why not decapitate the entire United States government? His new plan was audacious. 3 simultaneous assassinations, all at exactly 10:15 p.m. on April 14th. Booth would kill President Abraham Lincoln. Lewis Powell would kill Secretary of State William Seward, Lincoln's closest advisor and the man who'd prevented European powers from recognizing the Confederacy. George Atzerodt would kill Vice President Andrew Johnson, ensuring that no clear successor existed. With all 3 dead, the government would collapse into chaos. Maybe somehow the South could still win, or at least the North would suffer like the South had suffered. It was insane. But Booth was too far gone to care about sanity. On the morning of April 14th, Booth was at Ford's Theater picking up his mail. The theater manager, John Ford, mentioned casually that President Lincoln would be attending that night's performance of Our American Cousin. Booth couldn't believe his luck. He knew Ford's theater intimately. He'd performed there dozens of times. He knew every hallway, every door, every exit. He even knew which floorboards creaked. More importantly, he knew the presidential box was incredibly vulnerable. It was just a converted set of balcony seats with a door. Usually there was one guard, sometimes not even that. It was perfect. Booth immediately gathered his conspirators. At Mary Surratt's boarding house, he explained the new plan. Powell and Harold would go to Secretary Seward's house at exactly 10:15 p.m. Seward was bedridden after a carriage accident earlier in the week. His jaw was broken. He was weak. Powell would enter the house, go upstairs, and kill him. Harold would hold the horses and guide the escape. Atzerodt would go to the Kirkwood House, hotel where Vice President Johnson was staying. He'd knock on the door and shoot Johnson when he answered. Booth would kill Lincoln at Ford's Theater. All 3 attacks at exactly the same time. The government would be decapitated. Atzerodt immediately protested. He was a coward. He'd signed up for boat work, not murder. Booth called him pathetic, threatened him. Atzerodt reluctantly agreed, but he was already planning to back out. Mary Surratt had one final task. That afternoon, she rode to her tavern in Surrattsville, Maryland, about 13 miles from Washington. She left a package for Booth: guns, ammunition, and field glasses, supplies for his escape. She knew Lincoln was going to die that night, and she helped anyway. Everything was set. That evening, Lincoln almost didn't go to the theater. His wife Mary had a terrible headache. Lincoln himself was exhausted. He'd barely slept in days. He wanted to stay home, but they'd already announced publicly that they'd attend. The newspapers had printed it. People would be disappointed if they canceled. So at 8:30 p.m., Abraham and Mary Lincoln climbed into their carriage and headed to Ford's Theater. Meanwhile, Booth prepared his weapons. The Derringer pistol had only one shot, but at close range, one shot was enough. The knife was backup. He also prepared his escape. A fast horse waiting in the alley behind the theater. A route mapped out through Maryland to the Potomac River. Confederate sympathizers along the way who'd hide him. By 9 p.m., Lincoln arrived at Ford's Theater with Mary and their two guests, Major Rathbone and Clara Harris. The play stopped. The orchestra played "Hail to the Chief." The entire audience stood and applauded. Lincoln smiled and waved. He looked genuinely happy. The presidential box had only one guard assigned, John Frederick Parker. Parker was possibly the worst policeman in Washington. He had a record of being drunk on duty. He'd fallen asleep on duty. He'd even visited a brothel while supposed to be protecting Mary Todd Lincoln at a different event. He was a disaster. And true to form, around 10 p.m., Parker left his post. He went to the tavern next door, Taltaville's Star Saloon, to get a drink. The President of the United States was now completely unguarded. Booth arrived at the theater around 9:30 p.m. He went to the same tavern, had a whiskey, chatted with people who recognized him. Everyone liked Booth. He was charming. At 10 p.m. he entered the theater. Nobody stopped him. He was John Wilkes Booth, famous actor. Of course he belonged there. He climbed the stairs to the dress circle. The play was in Act 3. The audience was laughing at the jokes. Booth walked to the door of the presidential box. No guard. He opened the outer door quietly, stepped inside the small hallway, closed the door behind him. Then he took a piece of wood he'd prepared earlier and wedged it between the door and the wall, creating a barricade. If anyone tried to follow him, they'd be blocked. Now there was just one more door. The door to the box itself. He waited, listening to the dialogue on stage. He knew the play perfectly. He was waiting for that one line that always got the biggest laugh. Inside the box, Lincoln was slouched comfortably in his rocking chair. Mary was beside him, holding his hand. Major Rathbone and Clara Harris were watching the play. On stage, actor Harry Hawk delivered the line. "Don't know the manners of good society, eh? Well, I guess I know enough to turn you inside. Out, old gal, you sock-dologizing old man trap." The audience roared with laughter, nearly 1,000 people laughing at once. Booth opened the door, stepped inside, raised his pistol, aimed at the back of Abraham Lincoln's head, and fired. The bullet entered behind Lincoln's left ear. It tunneled through his brain, destroying both hemispheres, lodged behind his right eye. Instant devastation. Lincoln's head dropped. His body went limp. Mary screamed. Major Rathbone turned and saw Booth, lunged forward, trying to grab him. Booth dropped the pistol, drew his knife, and slashed Rathbone's left arm. The blade cut to the bone. Blood sprayed everywhere. Rathbone fell back. Booth vaulted over the railing, jumped 11 feet down to the stage. His spur caught the flag. He landed wrong. His left leg snapped. But he stood up, faced the audience, shouted, "Sic semper tyrannis," and ran off stage, limping badly, disappearing into the wings. Behind him, chaos erupted. Laura Keene, the lead actress, shouted, "The president has been shot!" Panic exploded. People screaming, running, pushing toward the exits. Upstairs, doctors rushed to the presidential box. They examined Lincoln. The wound was catastrophic. They knew immediately he wouldn't survive. They carried him across the street to William Peterson's boarding house, laid him diagonally across a bed, and waited for the inevitable. Lincoln died at 7:22 a.m. on April 15, 1865. He never woke up, never spoke, never said goodbye. This story is getting even more intense from here. If you're following along and want more people to know this history, share this video. Send it to that friend who loves historical mysteries, and leave a comment. Do you think Mary Surratt deserved execution? I want to know what you think. Continuing. While Booth was shooting Lincoln, two other attacks were happening simultaneously. Lewis Powell and David Herold arrived at Secretary of State William Seward's house at 10:10 p.m. Seward was in bed on E, the third floor. He'd been thrown from his carriage 9 days earlier. His jaw was broken in 2 places. He was wearing a metal jaw brace. He was in constant pain. Powell knocked on the front door. A black servant, William Bell, answered. Powell lied smoothly. He said he was delivering medicine from Seward's doctor. He needed to give it to Seward personally and explain the dosage. Bell let him in. Powell climbed the stairs. At the top, Seward's son Frederick met him. Frederick said his father couldn't see anyone. He was sleeping. Powell tried to talk his way past him. Frederick blocked the stairs, so Powell pulled out his revolver and pointed it at Frederick's head. He pulled the trigger. The gun misfired, so Powell smashed Frederick's skull with the pistol butt. Once, twice, 3 times. Frederick collapsed. His skull fractured in 2 places, blood everywhere. Powell kicked open Seward's bedroom door. Seward's daughter Fanny was inside, sitting by her father's bed. She screamed. Powell shoved her aside, drew his Bowie knife, and jumped onto the bed where Seward lay. He stabbed Seward in the face, the neck, the chest. But Seward was wearing that metal jaw brace. The knife couldn't penetrate his throat. The brace deflected the blade. Powell kept stabbing, slashing, blood pouring everywhere. Seward's other son, Augustus, burst into the room. Powell stabbed him in the forehead. Augustus fell. A soldier staying at the house, Private George Robinson, rushed in. Powell stabbed him in the shoulder. Then another State Department messenger arrived. Powell stabbed him too. 5 people stabbed in less than 2 minutes. Then Powell panicked. He ran down the stairs shouting, "I'm mad! I'm mad!" He jumped on his horse and rode away. Behind him, he left 5 people bleeding and wounded. Miraculously, all of them survived. Seward's jaw brace saved his life. Frederick survived despite catastrophic skull damage. Everyone recovered. Powell's assassination attempt failed completely. Meanwhile, George Atzerodt was supposed to kill Vice President Andrew Johnson at the Kirkwood House Hotel. Atzerodt rented a room there earlier in the day. Room 126. Johnson was in room 68. Atzerodt's plan was simple. Knock on Johnson's door at 10:15 p.m., shoot him when he answered, run. But Atzerodt was a coward. That evening, he went to the hotel bar, had a drink, then another, then another. He sat there getting drunk. At 10:15 p.m., he was still at the bar. He never went upstairs. He never knocked on Johnson's door. He never even tried. Around midnight, he stumbled out of the hotel and disappeared into the night. 2 of the 3 assassinations failed, but the one that mattered succeeded. Lincoln was dying, and John Wilkes Booth was escaping. After jumping from the stage at Ford's Theater, Booth limped through the backstage area. His leg was screaming in pain. The fibula was broken. Every step was agony, but adrenaline kept him moving. He exited through the back door into the alley. His horse was waiting, held by stagehand Edmund Spangler. Spangler had no idea what Booth had done. He was just holding the horse as a favor. Booth mounted up, kicked the horse, and rode. He galloped through the streets of Washington. Most people didn't know anything had happened yet. The city was quiet. Booth crossed the Navy Yard Bridge, the only route across the Anacostia River into Maryland. A guard stopped him. The guard's name was Silas Cobb. He asked Booth where he was going. Booth lied. Said he was heading home to his farm in Maryland. Cobb should have turned him away. It was after curfew. Nobody was supposed to cross. But Cobb recognized Booth. Everyone knew John Wilkes Booth, the famous actor. Cobb let him pass. That decision let Booth escape Washington. A few minutes later, David Herold arrived at the same bridge. He told a similar story. Cobb let him pass, too. Booth and Harold met up on the Maryland side and rode together toward Surrattsville. Around midnight, they reached Mary Surratt's tavern. The package she'd left was waiting. They grabbed the guns and supplies. Then they continued south. By 4 a.m., they reached the home of Dr. Samuel Mudd. Mudd was a country doctor and Confederate sympathizer. Booth had met him months earlier during the kidnapping plot. Mudd's farm was a known safe house for Confederate agents. Booth knocked on the door. Mudd answered. Booth explained he'd broken his leg in a riding accident. Mudd examined the leg. It was badly broken. He set it, made a splint, let Booth rest on his couch. Later, Mudd would claim he didn't recognize Booth, that he didn't know about the assassination until the next day. Nobody believed him. By morning, Washington was in absolute chaos. News of Lincoln's death spread. Thousands poured into the streets, some mourning, some celebrating. Riots threatened to break out. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton took control. He was furious, and he wanted revenge. He immediately ordered the largest manhunt in American history. 10,000 soldiers deployed. Cavalry units, detectives, bloodhounds. Every road out of Washington was blocked, every bridge guarded, every town searched. Stanton also ordered mass arrests. On April 17th, soldiers raided Mary Surratt's boarding house. They found weapons, found maps, found evidence of conspiracy meetings. Mary was arrested. While the soldiers were still there, Lewis Powell showed up. Powell had been hiding in a cemetery for 3 days. No food, no water. Covered in mud. Delirious. He'd come to the boarding house looking for help. The soldiers were still there. Powell tried to lie. Said he was just a laborer. Didn't know Mary Surratt. Mary backed his lie. Said she'd never seen him before. But Powell was carrying a pickaxe at 11 p.m. His clothes were filthy. His story made no sense. Both were arrested on the spot. Over the next week, everyone else was captured. George Atzerodt was arrested on April 20th in Maryland. He'd spent the week getting drunk and bragging about the conspiracy to anyone who'd listen. Samuel Arnold and Michael O'Laughlin were arrested in Baltimore. They'd quit the conspiracy weeks earlier, but they'd been involved. That was enough. Dr. Samuel Mudd was arrested at his farm. He'd helped Booth. He'd lied to investigators. Edmund Spangler, the stagehand, was arrested for holding Booth's horse. 8 conspirators in custody. But Booth was still free. For 12 days, Booth and David Harold moved through the Maryland swamps and pine forests. Booth's leg was infected, turning black. The pain was unbearable. He could barely walk. They relied on Confederate sympathizers, people who hid them in barns, fed them, moved them south. Booth expected to be hailed as a hero, the man who avenged the South. Instead, even Southerners were horrified. Newspapers called him a coward, a murderer, a lunatic. Even in the South, people mourned Lincoln. He'd promised a merciful Reconstruction, with malice toward none. Now, with Lincoln dead, they feared the radicals in Congress would be merciless. Booth's diary entries during this period show his delusion. He wrote that he was a hero like Brutus killing Caesar, that history would vindicate him, that he'd saved the South. He couldn't understand why everyone hated him. On April 24th, Booth and Harold finally crossed the Potomac River into Virginia. They were starving, exhausted, desperate. They found shelter at a tobacco farm owned by Richard Garrett, a Confederate veteran. Garrett agreed to let them sleep in his barn, but Garrett grew suspicious. These men were clearly running from something. Their stories didn't add up. On April 25th, Garrett locked them in the barn, planned to report them in the morning. He didn't get the chance. That night, the cavalry arrived, 26 soldiers from the 16th New York Cavalry, led by Lieutenant Edward Doherty. With them was Lafayette Baker, the detective leading the manhunt. They'd been hunting Booth for 12 days. Now they'd found him. They surrounded the barn at 2 a.m. Lieutenant Doherty shouted, "Come out! We know you're in there!" Inside the barn, David Harold panicked immediately. He wanted to surrender. Booth refused. "I prefer to come out and fight," he shouted back. They negotiated for over an hour. Finally, Harold couldn't take it anymore. He surrendered. Soldiers pulled him out of the barn. Now Booth was alone. Doherty gave one last warning. "Surrender now, or we burn the barn." Booth's response was defiant. "Well then, my brave boys, prepare a stretcher for me." He genuinely believed he could fight 26 soldiers and win. Doherty had no more patience. He ordered his men to set the barn on fire. Soldiers piled hay against the walls, lit it. Flames spread quickly through the dry tobacco barn. Through gaps in the wooden walls, they could see Booth inside, lit by the firelight, holding his carbine, looking for a target. He looked like a demon in hell. Sergeant Boston Corbett, a deeply religious man who believed God spoke to him, saw Booth through a gap in the wall. Against direct orders, Corbett aimed his revolver and fired. The bullet hit Booth in the neck, severed his spine at the base of his skull. Booth collapsed. Soldiers rushed in and dragged him out before the fire consumed him. He was paralyzed from the neck down, blood pooling under his head, choking. He whispered, "Tell Mother I died for my country." He tried to lift his hands, couldn't move them. Looked at them. His last words were, "Useless, useless." At 7:15 a.m. on April 26, 1865, John Wilkes Booth died. 12 days after he killed Abraham Lincoln. He was 26 years old. We're reaching the final part of this story. If you're not subscribed yet, now's the time. I make videos like this every week and you won't want to miss them. Now let's see how justice was served. Booth's death didn't end the story. The government wanted justice for everyone involved. 8 conspirators were in custody. Mary Surratt, Lewis Powell, David Harold, George Atzerodt, Samuel Arnold, Michael O'Laughlin, Samuel Mudd, and Edmund Spangler. The trial began on May 9, 1865. Less than 2 weeks after Booth died. It was a military tribunal, not a civilian trial. The rules were different. The standards for evidence were lower. There were no appeals. Many historians believe this was fundamentally unfair, but the government didn't care. They wanted convictions. The trial lasted 7 weeks. The evidence against most of them was overwhelming. Booth's diary named names. Witnesses testified about meetings at Mary Surratt's boarding house. Physical evidence tied them to the conspiracy. Mary Surratt's defense argued she only knew about kidnapping, not assassination. The tribunal didn't care. Conspiracy was conspiracy. Lewis Powell didn't even try to defend himself. He knew he was guilty. He'd stabbed 5 people. He accepted his fate. David Harold claimed he didn't know Booth was going to kill Lincoln, that he just helped him escape after the fact. Nobody believed him. George Atzerodt argued he'd never actually done anything. He didn't kill anyone. He didn't even try. But he'd been part of the conspiracy. That was enough. On June 30th, 1865, the verdicts came. 4 sentenced to death by hanging: Mary Surratt, Lewis Powell, David Harold, George Atzerodt. 4 sentenced to prison: Samuel Arnold, life; Michael O'Laughlin, life; Samuel Mudd, life; Edmund Spangler, 6 years. Mary Surratt's lawyers immediately filed for clemency. She was a 42-year-old woman, a mother. 5 members of the military tribunal recommended mercy. President Andrew Johnson reviewed the request. He refused. He said, "She kept the nest that hatched the egg." On July 7, 1865, the execution was scheduled. It was 1:15 p.m., brutally hot, over 95 degrees. 1,000 people gathered to watch. 4 people walked to the gallows in the courtyard of Washington Arsenal. Mary Surratt had to be held up. She was in shock, barely conscious. Her daughter Anna was in the crowd, screaming for mercy. Lewis Powell walked calmly. He'd made peace with death. His last words were about Mary. He said, "Mrs. Surratt is innocent. She doesn't deserve to die with the rest of us." Nobody listened. David Harold was terrified, shaking uncontrollably, crying, begging for his mother. George Atzerodt was praying loudly, desperately reciting the Lord's Prayer over and over. White hoods were placed over their heads, nooses around their necks. At 1:26 p.m., the executioner knocked out the supports. The four dropped. All died instantly. Mary Surratt became the first woman executed by the United States federal government. Her execution remains controversial to this day. Many historians believe she was guilty of conspiracy but didn't deserve death. Others believe she was fully complicit and got what she deserved. The debate continues. The four prisoners served their sentences at Fort Jefferson in the Dry Tortugas, Florida. A brutal military prison in the middle of nowhere. Michael O'Laughlin died there of yellow fever in 1867. The other three were pardoned in 1869 by President Johnson after he left office. Samuel Mudd spent the rest of his life claiming innocence. His descendants still fight to clear his name today. Most historians believe he was guilty. So what was the legacy of April 14, 1865? Abraham Lincoln's death changed everything. He had promised a soft peace, reconciliation, forgiveness. With malice toward death, none. With charity for all. He wanted to welcome the South back into the Union quickly and gently. Andrew Johnson was not Abraham Lincoln. Johnson was a Southern Democrat, a racist. He opposed giving rights to freed slaves. He fought constantly with the radical Republicans in Congress. Reconstruction became bitter and violent. The South was militarily occupied for 12 years. Former Confederates were barred from voting or holding office. Freed slaves briefly gained rights through the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. But when Reconstruction ended in 1877, those gains evaporated. The Ku Klux Klan rose. Jim Crow laws followed. Black Americans were systematically disenfranchised and terrorized for nearly a century. Would Lincoln have done better? Nobody knows. But most historians believe yes. Lincoln had the moral authority, political skill, and personal determination to guide Reconstruction successfully. Booth didn't just kill a man, he killed the hope of peaceful reconciliation. The cost was paid by millions. Today, over 150 years later, we still debate what happened on April 14, 1865. Was Booth a madman or a true believer? Were the conspirators terrorists or freedom fighters? Should Mary Surratt have been spared? The questions remain. But one thing is absolutely clear. One bullet changed the course of American history, and the price was paid in blood. This was the story of the conspiracy that killed Abraham Lincoln, a story of obsession, revenge, and justice delayed. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. Leave a comment. If you could ask John Wilkes Booth one question, what would it be? I want to know. Next week, I'm covering the final hours of the Titanic. The mistakes, the heroes, the tragedy. It's even more dramatic than this one. See you then. History never ends.